several years ago, my wife and I hired a manny, which is like a male nanny, who was the coolest person the two of us had ever met. And he came into our family at a really good time. We really needed childcare. But it was like that moment in a marriage. You've like been together for a long time. You spend a lot of nights together, and you could like need someone to bring you new stuff, like new cultural stuff, new ideas, like music that you're too old to find out on your own. And one night we were sitting around the table, and he's like, "Oh man, you've got to hear this comedian Aziz Ansari." We're like, "Who? Yeah, Aziz Ansari. He's the funniest guy." So he pulled out, a phone, and we started listening to Aziz Ansari stand up, and like totally fell in love with it. I thought this is the funniest guy I'd ever heard, and started watching all of his specials, and trying to track him down on Parks and Rec. And like, by the way, I'm like a trained professional sociologist. I spend most of my time doing social science, so I don't have a lot of companions in the sociology community who share my fandom. And a couple years ago, I was standing on the platform at Penn Station with 2 grocery bags in my hands, ready to go home upstate in the summer. I'm about an hour outside of the city, and it's hard to get good groceries. So I had these big bags full of groceries, and my phone rings, and it's my editor from the Penguin Press and the publisher of Penguin Press, Scott Moyers. And he says, "Eric, I'm sorry for calling you out of the blue, but I wonder if you have a minute." And I always have a minute for Scott. And he said, "Look, have you ever heard of Aziz Ansari?" And I said, "Aziz Ansari is my hero." And he said, "Well, that's great news, because he's actually sitting in my office right now. He wants to write a book about modern romance, and he'd like to work with a social scientist and talk to somebody about this. Can you come over here, or can you talk to us?" And I said, "Scott, I'm like literally carrying grocery bags. I'm about to go home. Is there any time I can do it later?" And he said, "Actually, not really. Aziz is here right now. Like, what can you do?" And I said, "Hold on a second." So I flipped onto the other line. I called my wife, and I knew I could get her permission to not come home that night. Not exactly like on the short list of people you're allowed to have indiscretions with your partner, but like a certain version of that idea. I knew she would be cool with it, and so I got the green light to dump the groceries at my mother-in-law's, go down and sit with Aziz, talk to him about this book, and it just became really clear that this was an amazing, amazing project, and you'd have to be completely crazy as a sociologist to walk away from it. So I didn't. For the last couple of years since then, the two of us have been working on this incredible project that I never really thought we'd be able to pull off, and the result, I think, is sitting in your hands right now. It's amazing to see it. It's not actually out yet, so don't tell anybody you guys have it. And we're just really thrilled that you pre-ordered it and got here tonight, and excited to have you help us launch the book. So without saying anything more, can you help me in welcoming Aziz Ansari?
Hello, thank you so much for coming. Wow. Well, I've never seen this many copies of the book. I have like 1 copy. You have just as many copies as I do. This is so cool. It's so funny hearing you tell that story about getting that call and being like, "Oh my God, Aziz. I know Aziz." I had a similar thing happen to me. Today, I'm working on this TV show, and we were scouting a location to find a location to film. We were in this Chinese restaurant in Midtown, and it was like kind of late lunchtime, and there was like a table of like these older women, a few Indian women, and they were looking over like, and I was like trying to like work with the crew, and I was like, oh, at some point they'll probably say something, I'll go and say hello or whatever. And then at a certain point, like one of these ladies, one of the older Indian ladies, like waved me down, and then I went over, and one of them said, there was like, "Are you the guy from Big Bang Theory?" And I said, "Yes, I am." But it was very awkward. Yeah. But thank you guys so much for coming. That's the funniest thing I've ever seen. Wait. Hold on. Wait, give me your phone for a second. This is what I just saw. This is literally what I just saw from Brienne, who's sitting there, who also has a name tag. You work at Strand. Okay. So this is what I just saw. I looked over. I see all these people. This is what I just saw. What the fuck are you doing? Wait, so you're filming that and you're texting someone and telling I'm filming it right now.
It's a lot more meta than that. I'm trying to test out Periscope, and I'm also tweeting about your event.
There's way too much stuff about the event. No one gives that much of a shit about anything, I don't think. Well, I'm periscoping it right now, and they're live tweeting the event. Oh my God! You just got a photo, right? You all you taking a photo. I mean, what are the chances you'll ever look at the photo ever again? I'd say there's 0% chance you'll ever look at it. I feel like you're just wasting the space on your phone. But no. Huh? It's your background. Me making fun of you for taking the photo. That's actually kind of cool.
Can we talk about the book a little bit?
Yeah, let's do that.
It's not unrelated.
We should get to that at some point.
It's not unrelated.
But it's not like they're gonna get another copy of the book. You already have a copy, so I feel like we should just talk about maybe Rich Dad, Poor Dad for a little while. I wrote that book as well.
I thought that was Ja Rule.
No, that's Rich Ja, Poor Ja. Similar themes, different interpretation.
So when we met that day a couple years ago, I remember thinking this is really cool, but also this is pretty unlikely, because I read comedian books every once in a while, and I really like to read books by comedians, but they're generally kind of memoirs and stories about how they learned to be funny and when they weren't funny in junior high and they became funny later and all kinds of things like that, which are good stories. And I remember when we first sat down, I actually thought that you wanted to do that kind of humor book and had that weird fantasy for a second that they'd actually called me because they thought I was a really funny sociologist. And I could see Aziz frowning, looking at me that's not why we have you here at all. But why this? Why a book about modern romance, and why try to do it with a social science-y perspective?
Well, I think when you do comedy and you have some success doing stand-up, people want you to do a book that's kind of a book of essays or some sort of autobiographical memoir-y type thing. And my thought on that was always well, any ideas that I have for a funny essay, I would rather use it to write a stand-up bit, and because I feel like that's a better form for me and I have more fun with that. But when I was doing stand-up about dating and kind of some of the issues that we eventually hit on the book, I kind of had this idea of I'd read these articles in New York Times or whatever about some of these issues, and I was I feel like if you paired me with the people that they quote in these articles and we had a dialogue about these kind of issues, it'd be really interesting, and it would also be really interesting to me to ask really smart academic people why certain issues like this exist. Why does when you're waiting to hear from a text, why does that really drive people crazy? Why is that a thing? And so I thought it would be an interesting idea for a book. So when I went and pitched the book or whatever, I was very clear. I was this isn't gonna be a book of my dating foibles. I want it to be this kind of weird thing where it's kind of a sociology book with my sense of humor in it, and the lovely folks at Penguin Press really got it. And then when I met with you, I was okay, we can pull this off. And I think it was one of those things where I don't think either of us really knew how we were going to pull it off, but once we started doing it, we figured it out. I feel like Eric and I, we started off, and I didn't know how we were going to pull this off, but and what the topics were going to be. I had a vague idea of what some of the issues would be, but once we started talking to real people and interviewing all these people, we really got a sense of like, oh shit, like this is really interesting, and we're learning a lot of things even from just talking to people, and we could kind of really make an interesting book out of it.
So you said that you didn't want to write a book about your dating foibles.
Mm-hmm.
But could I ask you to talk a little bit about one of your dating foibles?
Sure. I mean, it was inspired by my interest in it was inspired by my dating foibles, for sure. And there is like little pepperings of my personal moments, of course.
And they're dating foibles I think everybody can relate to, right? Like this, you talk a lot about this woman you met, Tanya.
Yeah, Tanya is an alias for this woman, but Tanya, the story about Tanya that it kind of begins a book and kind of like was the impetus for writing it in a sense was I'd met this woman and we were getting along really well and we hooked up a little bit. And I had one of those moments where I was really excited. You know, when you meet someone, you're like, oh shit, this is on. Oh my God, I've been single for a while, but this shit is on. God, what a relief, what a huge weight lifted off my back. Like, this is awesome. Me and Tanya, holy shit. Is happening, me and Tanya. And so, you know, I'm full of confidence. I text Tanya to go to a concert or something, and then she just didn't respond at all. And I was like, what the fuck is this? Tanya, what happened? I thought we were like gonna be a thing, and I was going crazy. And I was going crazy for no reason other than this person had not sent me a little message on my phone. And it made me realize, like, wow, that's not even a thing that could have happened to a person 20 years ago. And once I started doing it talking about this in my stand-up, I realized, like, oh, everyone's had this some version of this, you know, and everyone is sitting there looking at their phone and going through all this drama, and you think it's this very personal, private thing, but it's actually the most universal thing. Everyone has their drama in their phone. Even people in relationships have their drama on their phone, and it seems like it's this very private, personal thing, but it's actually very universal.
Yeah, and actually a big theme for us as we started doing this work, you know, was not just kind of dating, but the fact that we live our social lives and our personal lives through the filter of this medium, right? That we carry these things around. Actually, like, let me get kind of geeky and sociological just for a second, because I can't help it. Like, we're in a room full of strangers, and I'm always curious about who's here. How many of you guys carry a smartphone with you everywhere you go? Like, it's always in your pocket? How many of you guys are single? How many of you married? Okay, single, but living with somebody. Okay, very small number.
And how many of you like Asian people more than black people? So you like black people more than Asian people. All of you like black people more than Asian people. Okay, all right, so that's done. See, I'm a social scientist as well.
So it's good to know who you've got in the room, and yeah, he's well trained now. Could do some really boring stand-up shows from now on.
The stage is very wobbly.
High, right?
You feel that? You feel that shake? It's weird.
That'd be a crazy story. So one of the things that's interesting in terms of like your interest in this is that your parents had an arranged marriage.
Yeah, that's true.
And could you explain something about like that process and how that worked, and you know your conversations you've had with your parents about what it meant for them to form a life that way?
Sure. So yeah, my parents had an arranged marriage. They're from India, and I never really thought about how crazy that was until I got a little bit older, and ideas of marriage and stuff in my own life started to kind of get in my head. And I asked my dad, like, how did you do this? Like, what was your process? How did this happen? And he's like, well, you know, I told my parents I was ready to get married, and they found a few families that were kind of respectable families, and I met their daughters. And I was like, well, how many people did you meet before you decided on my mom? And he was like 2. And I was like, just 2 people? And I was like, well, what was wrong with the first lady? And he was like, oh, she was a little bit too tall. And then he met my mom, and then he was like, all right, this will work. And then they got married a week later. And to me, that's really crazy. I mean, especially like considering, me, who, when I had this conversation with my dad, I was single and like was even terrified of the idea of like having a girlfriend even, and was like I just couldn't believe it. And in one of our earliest conversations, I told Eric, I was like, to me, this is so crazy, because like I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, look at the process my dad had for finding a wife, and then look at my process for finding like where I should go get tacos. And I told Eric, I was like, what's crazy to me is like it was easier for my dad to decide on a wife than it is for me to decide where I want to get tacos. Like, I spend more time researching that. But as we did the book, what was interesting to me is like we talked to all these people in retirement homes and stuff, and a lot of them had a very similar process to my dad, even though they didn't call it arranged marriage. It was, a lot of these people said like, oh, we would meet someone in the neighborhood, then the families would meet, and the family would be like, all right, yeah, that guy will murder you, and then they would get married in a few months. I mean, it wasn't a week, but 6 months in these kind of times, it's kind of almost like a week. It's a pretty short amount of time, and it ended up feeling like pretty similar.
That was actually an amazing experience. So we went all over the world for this book. We got on airplanes and traveled long distances, but one of the days when I learned the most, we left the campus of NYU and walked down to the Lower East Side to this senior citizens home, and like sat down with a bunch of 80, 90-year-olds to learn about how they got married. And it was this amazing focus group, right? Because the first person was like, I got married when I was 21, and I married this guy who lived next door. He was friends with my brother, and he seemed pretty cool, so we just got married. And it was like, whoa, that's crazy. And then the next person went and was like, yeah, I got married when I was 19, and I married the guy who lived upstairs. And just like down the line, and person after person had these incredible stories. And I went and like pulled out some data from old sociology journals, and it actually turns out that these guys were completely typical. Like in the 1930s in Philadelphia, a huge city in the US, maybe the third biggest city at the time, something like 1 out of every 6 marriages was to someone who lived within 5 blocks. And about 1 out of every 8 marriages was someone who lived in the same building. And the patterns were amazing. And do you remember like the way that they explained it was also really surprising, right? Like why these people got married so young and to people who were so close.
You mean the women that we interviewed?
Yeah.
Well, what they said was really interesting, was that they were like, well, I was 20 years old, I was living at home, and I didn't have the basic freedoms that you had as an adult. And if I didn't get married, I had no other way out of the house, because I couldn't go to college, I couldn't start a career. And so we were like, well, are you saying you kind of got married just to get out of the house and be like a normal adult? And they're like, yeah. And it was really mind-blowing. And some of them had marriages that really blossomed and they really fell in love with their partners. And then other people you could definitely tell there was this kind of regret that they were with this person that they really weren't that connected with. And basically what they were kind of regretting was not having this period that now every young person has and really takes for granted, where you're just kind of a young person that dicks around and doesn't live at home. Like, that's a huge, awesome thing we all get to do. Like, to be a person that lives at home, you come home, you smoke weed, you do whatever the fuck you want. Like, that's an awesome thing that these people, mainly the women that we interviewed and these retirement homes, didn't have, and they really seem to regret it. And they would talk about how they would say like, oh, I always tell my granddaughter, like, live your life, like, meet a bunch of young people, like, wait a while before you settle down. It's a thing they really like took to heart, and it was really, I'd never heard anyone kind of express that sentiment. It was really interesting to me.
So now we live in a completely different world, right? We made a lot of scientific discoveries over the course of the research we did together, and one was that this is basically a 24/7 singles bar that you live with, that you carry with you wherever you go. I mean, to live today, it's not just the phone, it's also to have that period of life that you just described. Like, people in New York, the average age of first marriage in New York is over 30. It's pretty ordinary for people to spend their 20s and a big chunk of their 30s or go into their 40s as single people. That's a lot of time to be dating. There's all kinds of options for online dating. You can not date, you can not get married, you can stay single forever. We live in this age of incredible options, right? And that was like impossible to miss. So like, how do you feel about having all those options, having talked to all the people we talked to? Like, is this the best moment of all time to be single? Is this a terrifying moment to be single? What do you think?
I think it's probably, I would say it's maybe it depends on how your attitude toward it is. You know, there's two ways to look at all the options. If you treat all the options in one way where you see everything like, oh my God, I gotta find the best person and I'm so stressed out. What if this person I'm with, what if there's a better person here? If you're that attitude, then it's a horrible time to be single. But if you treat it with the attitude of like, oh wow, I can meet all these interesting people outside of my social circle. Oh, here's this person. I'm going to spend a lot of time with them and see if there's a connection there. Then I think you might do a little bit better. I mean, the options thing in New York, it's so... of all the cities we talked about, the whole issue of like, oh, there's so many options. In New York, it was where it kind of really resonated the most, because everyone's like, oh yeah, like anytime you like turn a corner, there's like 10 people you want to just fuck. And like, just like so many hot, interesting, supposedly interesting people. And it was just hard for people. People were like, it was hard to settle down. Like, how do you settle down in New York? Like, every time you turn a corner, there's just like so many people. How do you do it? And I could totally relate to that. It's really hard. And you know, the options thing, of course, besides being in a big city, it's kind of universal for people now in terms of online dating. And you know, the people that seem to be stressed out about online dating were the ones who really spend a lot of time like with this idea of like, oh, I've got to find the perfect person. I got to make sure I'm messaging the right people, and I got to make sure I have a good rapport with this person before I meet up with them, and got to send them weeks of messages. Like, those people failed miserably. They seemed horribly like distraught and stressed out and exhausted. But the people that actually met up with people and spent time with people in real life and treated it as one person described to us as more as an online introduction service, and did more of the dating part than the online part, those people seem really happy and excited with all the possibilities. I think it's really in how you kind of treat it.
I'm just remembering that we did these amazing focus groups, and I have to say, like, you know, I'm a social scientist, and so for me, one of the big challenges at work is trying to get access to data, right? Like, I'm trying to get information, and one of the really difficult things about understanding like dating and romance scientifically is like, people don't want to tell you the truth. Like, if I give you a survey and ask you to tell me your dating habits, like, there's probably a lot of stuff you're not going to tell me, and maybe there's stuff that you're not going to remember. You know, like a focus group with some random social scientist, it's going to be weird to divulge too much information, right? People are rightfully private about that. But like, when Aziz and I were working together and doing these focus groups, there's a whole different dynamic. And I think, you know, a lot of people we talk to know Aziz from his stand-up, and stand-up's a very, you know, personal, you know, genre, right? Like, you're giving a lot of yourself. So people have like some sense of who you are, and people were really eager to tell their stories. And they weren't just telling their stories, but this was really crazy to me. People were handing us their cell phones and opening up their OkCupid profiles, like projecting them up on a monitor, and like, we were reading from like the inside of their personal lives, right? So instead of just like seeing what people said about their relationships and their dating life, which may or may not have been true, we were actually like inside of it, reading the transcripts, oftentimes in real time, right? So we're learning all this incredible stuff. And I remember the first time we did this in New York, that there was a woman who had like this incredibly long interaction with someone on OkCupid, and he like asked her out, and she was completely freaked out about that. Remember, she was like,
oh yeah, this woman had like so many back and forths with this guy, and you talking about the guy was like, oh, should we get coffee sometime? So they had a bunch of back and forths where they were joking around and everything seemed fine. And then the guy was like, so, you know, I'd love to like actually meet up with you in person and actually hang out. Like, do you want to get coffee sometime? And she's like, I don't know that you're not a murderer. And me and Eric were like, what? Like, okay, like, he's just asking you to go get coffee at like a Starbucks or something. It's not like, hey, let's meet like, you know, in this alley in the Lower East Side, like, I'll be the guy holding the knife. Like, it seemed very innocuous, but that did seem to be a thing. And I get that, of course, there's so many, like, creepy guys out there or whatever, but that did seem to be a thing where people wanted to message back and forth, but seeing their actual messages was so interesting. The first time we saw the OkCupid account was we did that show. We did a show in LA. We did like the big, like, hundreds of people at this theater in LA, and we had this woman come up and she opened up her OkCupid account, and we're like, just log into your account. And Eric was like, no person is gonna log into their account and let you just like blast their screen up there. And I'm like, yeah, they probably will. It'll be fine. And they did, and as soon as she opened it up, first thing you notice is there's hundreds of like unread messages. And she's like, yeah, there's all these guys that have messaged me, and I just don't have time to respond to them. I probably will just delete these. And you saw all the guys in the audience like, huh? What? And she's like, yeah, there's just too many. Like, I just don't have the time. And anytime we looked at people's real shit, it was so interesting. The first time we did, even beyond the OkCupid, just even the text messages was so interesting. The first time we did this, we had like a room. It was like, I think it was like the very first kind of like group interview focus group thing. We said like, has anyone like been texting with someone recently, and because we were like, okay, well, this will be like a good starting place. Like, everyone's like texting with people or whatever. And so this woman like gave me her phone, and she's like, yeah, I've been texting with this guy. And I was like, okay, well, you mind if I look at it? And she's like, okay. And I look at it, and I was like, all right, well, this is interesting. His name is Kevin Don't Text Till Thursday. That's his last name? And she's like, yeah, I just don't want to seem overeager. And it was like a perfect example of like, oh, if you ask someone like, hey, what's going on with that guy Kevin, if you just asked it in a normal context, they'd be like, oh yeah, we've been texting. But then you look at their phones like, you fucking put Don't Text Till Thursday on here. Like, it just shows like how nervous people are and what extreme lengths they go to kind of play these games people play.
So like this brings up one of my favorite areas that we cover in the book, because like our species has done pretty well for the last couple 100,000 years. Like, we've managed to meet other people and have sex and reproduce, and we know how to like ask someone out and get to that stage. And you put a handful of single people in their early 20s in a room and say like, okay, you meet someone and you're into them. Like, what should you do? Should you call them? Should you text? Should you friend them on Facebook? Like, should you, like, what do you do? And the crazy responses that fly all over the place are completely fascinating. It's like a very, very hard time to figure out how to do the most basic stuff, and we really like zoomed in on this issue, like trying to understand like, what do people do when they're interested in someone? How do they communicate? What are people's expectations? For me, that was like one of the richest areas by far. There's a ton of stuff on that in the book. And one of the theories out there is that look, actually, it doesn't even matter what you say, because people are either attracted to you or they're not.
Does anyone believe that like, oh, it doesn't matter what you text someone. If they like you, they like you. Raise your hand if you feel like that's the case. So you feel like it doesn't matter what you say to someone. If they like you, they like you. All right.
So we now think we have scientific proof that that's not true. And the scientific proof actually came in a experiment we did at the Chicago Theater in downtown Chicago, when Aziz is doing stand-up, and he gets people to hand them their phones in front of thousands of people in Chicago. I saw most of that show, but didn't get to see all of it because Derrick Rose came and sat right in front of me. And I'm a huge Chicago Bulls fan, so I was like often like trying to look at his knee to see if he was going to be okay. But then also when I tried to look up, he was way taller than I thought he was going to be, so I couldn't see the show. But it was an amazing show, and this one exchange happened that for me scientifically solved the riddle of whether it matters what you text someone or how you communicate. I'm going to ask Aziz to read this just from the book because it's one of my favorite passages.
Okay. Okay, at this particular show, I was speaking with Rachel, who had met a guy at a good friend's wedding. As it happened, the guy was also a friend of her sister's, so he had a pretty good shot at a first date with her. She was single, she was interested. All he had to do was send her a simple message introducing himself and asking her to do something. Here's what happened. He sends his first message. Hi, Rachel. Since I never got a chance to ask you to dance at Marissa and Chris's wedding, I'm Chris's old roommate from Purdue. He and your sister gave me your number. I wanted to say hi and sort of Texty, introduce myself. Haha. Hope you had a great weekend. ... Hope to chat with you soon. As soon as I said Texty, it was clear that no one sitting in the 3,600 seat Chicago theater would ever fuck this dude in a million years. Texty, for whatever reason, seemed to be unequivocally disgusting to every one of us there. He may as well have added, by the way, I have a really disgusting next level STD. Haha, but for real, I do. Rachel wrote back 10 minutes later. Hey, great to meet you. Currently enjoying my birthday weekend with lots of good Mexican food. It happens when your birthday is Cinco de Mayo. Hope you had a great weekend too. He wrote back shortly, I totally realized upon leaving my mass message that I didn't include my name. I'm Will. Feliz cumpleaños as well. And totally digging on the Cinco de Mayo theme. Rachel never met Will. After a few messages of this nature, Rachel stopped responding. None of us know Will. He may be a kind, handsome man with a heart of gold, but all we have to go on is those messages. And those messages have shaped in our minds a very dorky, terrifyingly Caucasian weirdo.
QED, as we say in the ivory tower.
But that, that's kind of like, that guy's like especially dorky, but he didn't do anything that crazy, really. Like, I'm reading it kind of in a silly voice, but even just saying Texty, I feel like he just eliminated himself. Like, she was like, ugh, like, talking to her there, like, you could tell it kind of grossed her out. And there were so many people where you could tell there was like, people would have like a good back and forth with someone, and then someone would say one thing that kind of changed everything for them. And it's really like, it's an interesting thing. We realized, like, texting is kind of a medium that's very unforgiving in that regard. Like, if you're having a conversation with someone and you say something that doesn't maybe strike them the right way, you can sense their body language, their facial expression. You're like, oh, I've gone down a wrong path. Like, texting, oh, fuck, I fucked up. I gotta, like, but like on text, it's just marinating there. You're like, yeah, I said texty, that was clever. And you just don't know. So that's why I feel like, after all this, I'd always had the hunch that was kind of bullshit, that idea that, like, oh, it doesn't matter what you say to someone. I mean, I get it. Like, I don't think, like, if someone has no interest, you can craft this perfect message and, like, turn them into being attracted to you. But I do think, without a doubt, and I think we've scientifically proven it as much as we can, that if someone is attracted to you, you can fuck it all up by sending the wrong messages. Because I think what we kind of realized doing the research is, like, there's kind of you have two selves. There's your phone self and your real self. And if your phone self fucks up, it reflects badly on your real self.
And people do crazy stuff with their phone self. Like, when you're on your phone, even when you're sober, people do all kinds of things that are deeply ill-advised, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of the extreme of, like, okay, you could take the extreme of, like, there's a guy who, like, texts a woman and says, like, hey, can you, like, Snapchat me a photo of one of your boobs? Okay, well, that guy, he's an idiot, right? Okay, but then you have, like, this guy, and he's just said, hey, like, 10 times. And out of context, that doesn't look that bad, right? You're just saying, hey. But taken in totality, like, that guy, his phone self looks really dumb. And I love how he, like, changes the capitalization. He was like, okay, the lowercase A's, I gotta get a little more formal. And then finally, he drops the second Y in there. He's like, I've gotta let her know this is flirtatious. In May of 2014, he's like, hey.
And you don't see that, right? Like, that's a 6-month span. So if you're sending the messages out, you don't necessarily see the chain going that way, right? Like, you don't realize what you're doing.
What's crazy, in October, he sent hey with 3 Ys, and then he did fuck that girl. So that's kind of the update we didn't have time for.
So I hadn't gotten that news, so that's good.
But even with just the one hey, what's interesting is, like, again, like, talking to a group of women and asking them, like, what do guys text you was so illuminating for me. Because, when we started writing the book, I just kind of started seeing someone, so I was kind of out of the single world. But, like, hearing these women talk about what guys text them is so interesting because, like, you think, okay, just, 10 hays is obviously horrible, right? But myself and many other guys I know have probably texted women things that's like, hey, what are you doing tonight? Hey, what's up? Just like very generic things. But when you talk to these women, they're like, oh yeah, I just have a phone full of just guys going, what's up? What are you doing tonight? Huh? What's up? Hey, want to hang out tonight? And it's just very, very, very like boring. And if you're a guy saying that, your phone self looks pretty boring and dumb, and you might be a really interesting person. And it was really mind-blowing, like, after we talked to like all these women and asked them, like, well, we kind of figured out like our factors for like the things that resulted in a text that really appealed to women, and there's a few factors that helped me out here. But one of them was just, the main thing was just inviting them to a specific thing at a specific time. Just saying, hey, do you want to go to this thing here at this time? That alone was enough to make women's vaginas explode. Like, we'd say, hey, what if a guy, what, actually inviting me to a thing? Yes, like, I would just fucking go. Like, I don't even know who the guy is or what's happening, but I'm there, because every other guy is just writing, what's up?
Then there were two like next level things, right? Like if you had met the person in real life and you could make some reference to something you had said in the conversation or something the other person had said that like makes it clear that you actually remember that person as a specific human being and you're not just like randomly sending that text message out to 50 people. Mm-hmm. And then like the third thing was if you could actually be a little bit witty and say something funny that was like you hit it out of the park.
If you had all of those things, like people were like, oh my God. Like the thing about like remembering something specific about the person, that was really interesting to me. Like there was one woman who said like, we asked a bunch of women like, what was like the best first text message you ever got from a guy? And this woman was like, I remember this one guy was like, hey, what are you doing tonight? How did the move go? And I just thought it was so sweet that he remembered that I was moving. And the text was like years ago. And she's like, I just remembered that he remembered that I was moving. And it just showed that he was paying attention to me. And it really, like, you just realize, like, if you're a dude, you read this book and you realize, like, how fucking low the bar really is.
Now, the other thing that was surprising, because when we started, we were trying to figure out some of the gender dynamics here as well. And we kept getting these stories of, like, even, like, hanging out with younger, really kind of progressive, empowered women that the gender norm was that men were asking out and texting much more than women were. And then like we went to, we obviously got lots of stories where that wasn't the case, where women were taking the first move. But the data we got from Match.com and from the other companies that own these online dating sites backed this up. That was like surprising the extent to which men are still expected to send the first message and are sending the first message. I don't know if there's anything to add on that, but I thought that was.
Yeah, it was still kind of most of the kind of the initial ask was happening on the guy side, and that kind of stress was definitely more weighted towards dudes. But what's interesting is if you read like what we found from talking to all these women, like what you have to do seems really simple to really kind of stand out and kind of make a positive impression.
Right. And there's another interesting thing, like in the course of the time that we were doing this research, Tinder kind of like came out of nowhere to just like dominate the dating scene, and especially in a lot of the bigger cities we're in. How many of you guys are on Tinder? I don't think anyone wants to admit it for some reason. Now, honestly, how many of you guys are on Tinder? A few more hands.
Yeah, there was like one more person that was like, okay, I'll say yes now that he asked a second time. That was really interesting because it started out, all these things, these online things, is interesting to see kind of their evolution. Because we did this book over the course of maybe like a year and a half, 2 years. And in the beginning, when Tinder first came out, people were like, oh, I mean, I have it as a joke, and people just use that when they want to fuck. And then when we did kind of the later, towards the tail end of the book, we interviewed people. People were like, oh, that's where I meet people. It's so much easier than using the traditional online dating sites. And it had totally evolved in its perception. And I noticed the same thing with like OkCupid. When OkCupid was first out, people were like, oh, well, that's the one you use if you want to fuck people. And then it was like, oh, that's where I meet people. That's what everyone's on. That's the free one, and everyone uses it and whatever. And all these things kind of evolve. And it's so weird, like how, you know, what seems crazy at one point ends up becoming the norm just a short amount of time later.
That's right. And, you know, it seems to me like you became a little bit more bullish on Tinder than some of the critics who think of it as just being like a very superficial app. And, you know, obviously one of the things that Tinder does is you only can communicate if both people have swiped right? So that like it kind of reduces the unwanted messages. But then another thing is that it like makes it gets you offline. Right, so many people when we talked about online dating talked about just the exhaustion of doing it. Like I can't tell you how many people in our focus groups look burned out by like the Match.com and OkCupid. They spend all this time like filling out profile information and then like filtering things and writing messages and just kind of like flipping through profile after profile after profile, and they felt like burned out. Whereas like when people talked about Tinder, it was a little bit more like it was playful and fun. Oh, it's like something I do with my friends.
I honestly feel like Tinder, like if you read like all the stuff we learned about online dating and you took out the Tinder section, obviously, I feel like you would read it and be like, oh, I should create Tinder, because it solves so many of the problems we address. Like from talking to people about like the normal online dating, how many people, raise your hand if you use like one of the other online dating sites? Okay, so there's a lot of people. Which sites do you guys use? OkCupid. Okay, well, this is what everyone said about OkCupid. Tell us if this kind of matches up with your experience. Everyone's like, it feels like a second job. It's exhausting. I come home. There's so many messages. I don't feel like fucking answering them. Like finding the right person. Like you're filtering through all these profiles and all this stuff. And every single time we brought it up, people were like, any of these online sites are like, it's exhausting. Going through all this shit. It's so much of a hassle. And so that's one. Two, the other thing is we found like people would say they want certain things, and then that is like there's so much, you know, studies and stuff that have gone into showing that like we're not really good at saying what we want. And putting all these filters in and saying like, I want someone that's this height, that has this color hair, and goes to this school. And it doesn't really mean anything. I experienced that even myself. When I was writing some standard about online dating, I filled out like a dummy profile. First off, there was so many goddamn questions. And I was asked an assistant, I was like, just fill out what you think I would say. And it was so much work. And then there was a part where you like say like what this person looks like or whatever, and I put, you know, someone maybe a little bit shorter than me that has dark hair and is younger than me. And now I'm dating someone that's older, who has blonde hair, and is like a little bit taller than me. And so it's like I experienced that statistic myself. I was like, oh shit, they're right. Like you are bad at kind of picking yourself. So Tinder kind of eliminates that because there's no filters or anything. You just kind of just see people and you just see their face and you swipe it. And my take on that is like, okay, like there's one way of looking at it, like, oh, it's so shallow. But it's like, all right, well, if you meet someone in real life, what happens? You see their face and your brain's like, oh, looking at that face makes it feel good. Just go to the face and say something to that face. And that's all that's happening. You're basically just like swiping right on a person, and it's the same thing. So to me, it's really kind of a cynical view to be like, oh, it's such a shallow thing. Like, oh, so being attracted to someone's, you know, appearance is a shallow thing. I mean, that's just the way people are. Certain people, you're attracted to them, and when you swipe right, it's the same as just seeing someone at a bar and going up to them. It's no less shallow.
So one of the things we observed was that it was hard to get to that first date, but there was another thing that we kept hearing from people in our focus groups, and that is that the first dates were often really, really shitty. They had a terrible time, and people were tired of just like having these bad meetings, and one of the issues was like, people didn't want to overinvest in a first meeting with some random person who they see online, so they would like bring down the cost and the investment by like meeting at a Starbucks or meeting. We met this one guy in Los Angeles who was like the most tired looking person that Aziz and I had ever seen in our lives.
God.
And all.
It was so funny because it was like we were doing this thing in LA, and it was like, okay, this is gonna be like a big group interview about online dating, and there was these two Indian dudes there, and one dude was named Manish, and another dude was named like Arpan, and like when we saw them, it was so interesting. The Arpan, like the Manish dude, we were like, hey, like have you met anyone of this? He's like, yeah, like, you know, I went out with this woman. We went and saw a movie recently, and then we got dinner. It was pretty fun. And then we went to the ARPA guy. He's like, I've been single for about a year now. And, you know, at first it was kind of fun, but, God, at a certain point it just gets exhausting. I mean, I got an OkCupid account, and, fuck. Sorry, man, can you give me a minute? Anyway, I have my OkCupid account, and he described this descent into darkness that we really detail in the book that was so fascinating to me. He started out and he was like, oh, you know, when I started out, I was so excited. There's so many options out there, and I would go on these sites, and I was meeting all these women. I was so excited, but then I just started getting burned. I would go on these dates, not have a good time. So I was like, you know what? He's like, I used to like find like a great restaurant. I would take the women to the restaurant, and we'd go eat dinner and have this great dinner. But at a certain point, I was like, fuck that, because like I'd go to dinner, and like within 5 minutes I'd be like, fuck, I gotta finish dinner with this person. And so I changed my date. So now I have a different kind of date. And I was like, well, what do you do for your date now? And he's like, well, there's a bowling alley pretty close to my house, and I go there. And I was like, what, so you take him bowling? That doesn't sound bad. He's like, no, we have a drink in the lounge. And so that's what he did date-wise. And then message-wise, he said he used to write these like long, like thoughtful messages. And then he's like, that just took too much effort, so now I just send these douchebag messages that are like, hey, you're hot, let's grab a drink. And he just started mass messaging those. He's like, and it actually ends up working out better for me. And it was so, that kind of this descent was just so sad and interesting how he got so tired by it.
But he turned things around, and right, like there's a good story about him at the end of the book. We won't spoil the punchline for you. You'll have to get there yourselves. But we did learn in the process of like thinking about all this stuff about well, the monster truck rally theory of dating.
Yeah.
And also the Flo Rida theory of acquired likability through repetition.
Yeah, well done. These three are two essential, like, you know, the book is not an advice book, right? But, I mean, if you take everything we've learned and applied it, you can kind of, you know, suss out. It's inevitable that we had some sort of kind of advice, right? And those two things I think are huge. You know, the first thing you mentioned, the
monster truck rally.
Monster truck rally.
You guys
theory.
have heard of that,
yeah,
right?
No, that's a thing we made up for the book. But there's basically, you know, you start with the kind of obvious premise that like we have the most romantic options of any group of people that have ever wanted to you know, find someone. We have the most options ever, but I think the problem is like we're horrible at analyzing them. A lot of people, especially in New York, I think feel like they just want to sample as many people to find this perfect person, but the way they like analyze these options, it's like these very boring, mundane dates where you're just like, let's go get a drink, let's go get a coffee, and you just end up having this boring resume exchange that tells you nothing about this person, and no one is gonna pass that test. If you're tired from work or something, you go get coffee with someone, it really has to be something special to like make it rise above just a boring resume exchange. And I'm sure a lot of these people are really interesting people, but you put them in this kind of environment where you're just doing this boring resume exchange. I think it's very hard for anyone to live up to be something exciting. So the monster truck rally theory came about because I was talking to this gentleman who worked with us a lot on the book, this guy Rob Willer, who's a sociologist at Stanford, and he was talking about how there was this period when he was in college where him and a few of his friends, these social science buddies of his, started doing this thing where for dates, they would go to monster truck rallies, like these crazy, like monster truck rally where there's huge cars that like jump over a bunch of school buses, and like it's a crazy spectacle, right? And he said like a lot of people that went on these dates, they ended up being great dates because what happened was, instead of like being in a boring resume exchange, you were in this kind of weird environment where you actually got a sense of like what this other person was like, and what your vibe was like, and what you guys are like, and what your sense of humor is like. And so you had a better sense of like what it was like to actually be with this person, rather than like, oh, I went to school here, I have a sibling who also goes to a college at the moment. And so the idea was like, oh, you'd have way more likelihood of finding a spark if you did more interesting things. And after we had that conversation, we did some research, and there's been studies that have done, like there was a study done where they took married couples and had the couples do different types of activities. One type of activity was kind of a boring, kind of standard activity, like going and getting dinner and seeing a movie. Another activity was more exciting, like hiking or skiing. And then the other group did nothing. And they were like the control group. And the people that did the exciting activities showed more success in their relationship. So there's, you know, kind of just, there's some scholarship that even shows that, like, yes, this does work. Like when you do more interesting, kind of out of the ordinary things, it helps you out. And the other part is the flow rider theory of acquired likability through repetition. And that idea is like, you meet, I feel like there's such a tendency we found of people to kind of go on a lot of first dates where you meet someone, you're like, that person sucks. There's so many other people. Let me go out with another person. Oh, that person wasn't any fun. There's other people online. I'll go out with someone else. And there's a lot of scholarship that shows that, like, the more time you spend with a person, the more, I mean, it's kind of just a basic common sense thing of just like, yeah, the more time you spend with a person, the more likely you are to kind of to kind of grow to like them. And the idea of that is like, you know, instead of just like going out with someone once and being like, oh, they suck. Like if you go out with someone once and you feel like it's like as far as a date goes, it felt like a 5 out of 10. If you went on like 2 more dates with them, I probably would go up to like a 6 or 7, maybe. I don't know, because you have more to draw from in your experiences together, and there's just so much that shows like the more time you spend with people, the better you kind of get to know them. And it seems like there's kind of this unrealistic expectation that you're just gonna like have this magical spark right away, and especially if you're doing kind of boring, mundane shit, I just don't think it's gonna happen. So the flow rider theory is basically saying like everyone is basically like a flow rider song. Like the first time you hear it, you're like, all right, flow rider, I get it. It's very similar to your previous songs. I'm moving on. I'm changing the station. But if you keep hearing the Flow Rider song, eventually like, all right, Flow Rider, you've done it again.
So another area that we hit on the flip side of this has to do with just how complicated it is to get out of a relationship when so much of what it means to build intimacy with someone these days involves sharing a life on social media, right? Because when we date somebody, especially for a long time, we're not just kind of hanging out with them a lot, like we're friending each other's friends, we're sharing, basically everything. We're there, they are on Instagram, their friends are there on Instagram, they're there on Facebook, you name it, we're out there, we're getting intertwined. Now it ends, and what do you do?
When you break up. Yeah, that was the thing where a lot of people say, like, when you break up, it's really hard to break up with people now because they live on in your digital world. Like, you see photos of them, even if you delete them off your Facebook or whatever, you see their friends posting photos, and it's hard to escape people, and people are like, it's harder to get over people now because you just keep seeing them. You can't get away from it anymore. That was interesting, just like how much stuff to me, like when we talk to people, like even people in relationships, how much like phones and everything kind of still ended up being a big factor in how their lives went. Like when you start dating someone, it's kind of like your digital worlds kind of meld too. Like the idea of like, well, do you give your partner your phone password? That was like, there were so many wildly different answers. Like, how many of you guys are in relationships again? Raise your hand if you're in a relationship. Okay, now keep your hands up. Now, if your partner has your password for your phone, put your hand down. Oh, shit! No one gives their passwords out anymore. I feel like
this is a long-running debate that Aziz and I have been having.
This is interesting because I think like as you get younger, there's less people that want to share their passwords. They're like, that's kind of my world. And as you get older, people are like, well, yeah, I mean, they have my password. Yeah, I mean.
So we did this focus group one night, a big one for people who were in relationships, and you could only come if you came by yourself, right? You couldn't bring your partner.
And the idea was like to get people to open up about like issues they have with their partner, and talk about things they wouldn't talk about if their partner was
like
there.
we spent a lot of time talking with Dan Savage, the sex columnist in Seattle for the book, and he's got this big concept of he's really interested in the kind of the monogamish relationship and open relationships, and we talked we thought like, oh, we're going to generate a big conversation about people's frustrations with monogamy. Nobody wanted to talk about that at all. Everybody wanted to talk about snooping and social media and like how they and their partners dealt with all this stuff. So like you're sitting next to your partner's phone and a text message pops up. Do you look at it?
It's like from a guy named Nathan. You don't know who Nathan is. He sent a message. Who's Nathan? Then another message comes up. Now there's 2 messages from Nathan. Now there's 3. There's 6 messages from Nathan. Do you open it up and see who the fuck Nathan is? Like, these are the kind of things people were really like wanting to talk to us about. Like, there's like one girl who's like, yeah, my boyfriend keeps liking Instagram photos of this bitch. Just stuff like that. Like, it's crazy. Like the things that kind of just get people on a jealousy tear. Just like, oh, my boyfriend just keeps liking photos of this girl on Instagram. I don't know what's going on, and she keeps writing on his Facebook wall. I'm like, bitch, I'm his boyfriend. I'm his girlfriend. You know this. Why are you writing this? And these are just issues that just would have never come up before. But at the same time, they're kind of, the idea we came up with is kind of like old issues in new forms. Like, oh, your girlfriend is mad at you for liking a photo of this woman on Instagram. That's like, being at a bar or something and you're ogling some girl and she's like, what are you doing? But it's weird how now there's like a concrete thing. Like, I wasn't looking at her. You hit like. You looked at it and you liked it and you pressed the button. You made a choice.
So we want to have a little time for you guys to ask some questions, but before we do, and when we do, I think we've got a microphone, so we're going to you'll get the mic when we call on you. There was, in the book, we spent a lot of time just talking about the frustrations and confusions that everybody has putting together a personal life and a romantic life with these phones, and there are a lot of difficult problems that everyone's working through, but there was one really cool thing that I thought it would be nice to end on. And we kind of hit this towards the end of the book as well, and you tell a story about a gift you got from your girlfriend that involves your social media and the life you had there together. I think it's a pretty cool way of kind of reminding us that there's some amazing things that happen because of all this digital stuff as well.
Yeah, I think the gift my girlfriend gave me was like a year into it was like our year anniversary. She gave me this gift. It was like a bound like book that had basically just it was like every single text message we'd ever sent each other, and like she had them all like written out, and then like beside each one like wrote like what was going on. And I got her a neck pillow. No, I didn't. No, I got her something really nice. But she like wrote out like all this stuff about like what was going on in her head, like when we sent these messages, and it was so interesting looking back on it, because there was stuff where she was like talking about like, oh, here, like you didn't write back for this long, and I started to get worried that maybe I had said something wrong, and I was like, I was waiting on purpose. And I basically just realized like, oh man, like, we're all sitting here like on these things by ourselves, like, oh fuck, what do I do? But the person on the other end's also going like, oh fuck, what do I do? And so we're kind of all in the same boat in the end, is what that made me realize. And it also made me realize like, yeah, for all the stress and whatever, like there's also really cool things. Like you have that kind of record of a relationship, of kind of romantic interactions that you would have never had before. All right.
So we have questions?
Let's take some questions.
Okay. Go in the middle. Just stand up too. Thanks.
Hi.
Before, just for the Q&A, before you ask your question, just say, would she like more black people or Asian people? So go ahead and then ask your question. So blacks or Asians? Go ahead, sir. I'm kidding. Go ahead.
Okay, bouncing off the idea of the phone password, Did you guys come across the phenomenon of the shared Facebook account or the other shared social media? Because that is the creepiest thing that married people I know do, and I want to talk to them all privately, separately, to disabuse them of this idea.
I don't think that came up too much. I mean, I can't think of anyone that had like a shared thing. I know a couple that has a shared email, and I'm like, what the fuck are you doing? So crazy. But I don't know.
So we got into this. I mean, we didn't actually come up with anyone who did that, but I remember reading this article about a site in South Korea, which the New Yorker profiled, and the whole idea was it allowed couples to build a social media world together. And I thought that was really interesting because one of the theories out there is that all of this new social media stuff is just designed to atomize us and pull us into these different worlds where we can't help but be tempted by like friending our exes and following them and having easy access to flirtation. The notion we got from some people, like we talked to Barry Schwartz, the guy who wrote this great Paradox of Choice book, who he writes about that famous study that Sheena Iyengar did about the jams, right? Like if you...
You're saying that like everyone knows it. Like, he wrote about the Sheena Iyengar study about jams. You know the study, the jam study.
I bet they know the jam study, right? So if you're shopping and you put out like a display of jams, if you put out 3 jams, you're less likely to stop, but you're much more likely to buy a jam than if you're confronted with a display of like 25 jams. You get overwhelmed, right? And so like Schwartz, kind of in our conversation with him, took that idea into the realm of dating and was like, people are just fucked, like with all the choices and the online stuff and the social media. And so I thought it was kind of cool that they had developed this app in South Korea that was really about like letting 2 people build an online world together. No one else got access to it. They could post like notes and messages, basically to do what your girlfriend did for you, but in real time.
Yeah, it was called Between, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so the idea would be like you open up the app and it's just you and one other person. You can't talk to anyone else in that. And you can send pictures, you can send messages, but it's all just between you and this one other person. And so we read that and I was like, oh, Eric, I'll download that and use that with my girlfriend and see it. And we used it for like a day. I'm like, this is stupid.
But it's big in Korea. Okay, yeah.
Hey.
Hi.
Sit down. No, you can stand if you like.
So my question, you mentioned phone personality versus real personality.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I don't know if you've, in this study, whatever, have you heard about catfishing? And if you could comment on that and what it is and how you interacted with it.
We didn't encounter anyone that experienced that firsthand. It wasn't something I was like really curious about because I felt like it was covered so much in just that idea and that TV show and everything. Myself, I wasn't. We didn't really get into it too much, really.
Well, it meant more on the the lower level, like just like interacting with somebody on OkCupid versus in real life, not in the like it's a man on their profile and it's a woman in real life.
Oh, you mean it's like how people felt about meeting someone online and then meeting them in person and seeing a difference. I mean, there were some people that described like, oh, like when I was on like OkCupid, we would message back and forth and we'd have these really amazing conversations, and then when I saw them in person, it was kind of like it felt like a dud and that wasn't there. There was other people we talked to who said like, oh, we were able to build this rapport online that we met in person. It like took off even more. But I think the more common thing was just like, more common thing was just I felt like overall my feeling was like, oh, like you just do so much better just when you get off the device and just actually spend time with the person in real life. Like I feel like ultimately you wanted to see if your real world self kind of vibes with the other person in the real world, and the quicker you get off, whether it's texting to try to make a plan with someone or messaging with someone on an online site to see if you want to go out with them, it always seemed like the quicker you got off and actually met a person in person, the better off it was.
Okay.
Hi. So I was curious because you did a lot of stuff with texting, and there's already anxiety when you send any text and get one, like, oh my God, what does this mean? And now within the last year, there's emojis.
Sure.
Like, did you guys find anything when you were going through people's phones, like what those meant?
What's interesting about emojis is like, it was weird when you look at anyone's like conversations, these kind of initial conversations that we looked at. That was probably what we looked at the most. You know, like, oh, you just met someone, you've been texting back and forth with them, what's going on, right? It was so interesting. You'd see like some people would text a bunch of emojis, and the person they're writing to clearly never used emojis. And it was like, you'd be like, dude, you gotta stop using these emojis. They're not using them back. And I feel like that was kind of an interesting thing, seeing like what effect that kind of like the kind of mirroring of the kind of style of texting had. You know, some people were very casual in their text, other people were more formal, and they would say, oh, well, if someone didn't, you know, capitalize their text properly and misspelled stuff, it would be a huge turnoff. And other people said like, oh, if a guy ever texted me emoji, like I would be done, like I would seem so juvenile to me. And other people like, oh, I think it's fun and flirty. And again, it's like a weird thing where everyone has their own. The problem is like you can't really have any like, well, this is what you should do, because everyone has a different kind of personal policy. Like one of my favorite things is like we were doing a focus group, and we were like, well, what would you prefer? Like if a guy called you on the phone or texted you, and one woman was like, if a guy called me, I would melt. I would love that. And then we asked another girl's like, if a guy called me, I would be terrified. I don't know why the fuck is he calling me? Like, he should just text me. That's crazy. And and every guy in the focus group was like, oh, brother. So yeah.
Hi. So after doing all this research and focus groups about the kind of current state of modern romance, where do you kind of see, if you're going to write a book about postmodern romance, and with the advent of kind of virtual reality and virtual porn or anything like that, where do you see the future of romance going?
I mean, probably like douchey dudes teleporting their dick to women.
Look for that in about 2 years.
How has creating this book changed your personal approaches to romance?
Me personally, I don't know. I mean, I'm in a relationship will be about 2 years in July, and I feel like I'm still kind of figuring out how to be in a relationship and stuff. And you know, the book doesn't get into so much about like how to kind of navigate being in a relationship. It's kind of more weighted probably to the kind of single side of things, but you know, I always kind of operate under the assumption that I know nothing about anything, so I'm just as confused as I always was.
Yeah, I'm married, and so I changed all my passwords.
Hi. So I've gone to a couple of your shows now, and I'm like not a creepy stalker, but
sure, no.
I've gone. And I always notice, I mean, you're obviously funny somewhat, but the way that you talk about your girlfriend is always
it's okay, guys.
I know, I'm obviously joking, but the way you talk about your girlfriend is always very endearing.
Sure.
And I like that about you.
Oh.
So I was wondering what, I'm also like somewhat hitting on you, I guess, but what hooked her? Like, how did you get her and keep her?
How did I get my girlfriend?
Engaged? Are we getting the inside scoop?
What? Sorry, what?
Like, how did you get her?
How did I get her?
And keep her?
I mean, well, I had like a lasso, and I was like, I gotcha! I don't know. I mean, the same way you get in any kind of relationship. We just had a lot of fun together and didn't want to stop hanging out together, and we just haven't stopped hanging out. I don't know. I don't have any kind of way to like break it down. We just really enjoy being with each other, I guess. Yeah, sorry. no complicated.
Yeah, in the back left, yeah.
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering did you do any sort of purposeful research across generations to look at how people interact very differently through social media in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s?
For sure.
All those age groups are involved in it now, and back when it started, it was really just people in their 20s. So.
Yeah, I think the younger you get, the less comfortable people were with more traditional forms of communication, like, or I guess you call it traditional, like when we talk to older people, like not older people, but like when we talk to like, as you got older, like in people's 30s, 40s, if you talked about phone calls, there was more a tendency to be like, oh, that would be nice and refreshing to get a phone call. And then when you got to people in their 20s, they're like, I don't know why the fuck anyone would call me. Like, that seems crazy to me. Who the fuck uses a phone? Why would you call me? And just like, there's a thing and when you get even below the 20s, like there was what was the number about the prom? Just like there was like a study where about like how like would you be comfortable with someone asking you out to prom over text, and it was like, I don't remember the number, but it was over 50%. It was like it was over 60% probably. That's not good social sciences. It was over something probably. But it was really stunning to me, like how comfortable people were with this. And that seemed like a pretty big deal to get asked to prom, and the idea of like that happening over text and not in person, it seemed really weird to me. But I think overall, the trend I think Eric and I noticed is like what seems crazy to one generation ends up becoming the norm of the next.
So the only thing I'd add is that, we spend a lot of time talking to the social psychologist Sherry Turkle, who has a book about kind of the decline of conversation. The Penguin's going to publish in the next year or so. And, her view is that younger people are spending so much time texting and just kind of communicating digitally that they're like losing the muscle that they have for conversation. And I think Aziz and I have, like, sometimes we see that, but we saw a lot of conversation too. But there was this like mind-blowing night we did a different focus group in New York, and it was we wanted to look at this generation's issue. So you could come, but you could only get in if you brought a parent or grandparent. And then everybody came in, and we split people up. So you put like the younger people on one side of the room and the older people on the other side of the room. And we had some people we were working with who were there, and after the focus group ended, they came over and said, like, the most amazing thing happened, like, before you guys came out. On the one side of the room with the younger people, like, every single person was waiting for us, like, with their phones. They're all just like texting away, and on the other side of the room, all the parents and grandparents were talking to each other. And it made us wonder, like, is this face-to-face conversation, becoming less common when there's no real reason to talk to the person sitting next to you, because you could talk to, like, your best friends and get on social media, like, just by picking up your phone.
Or just look up the hippopotamus Wikipedia page for no reason. You can do that as well. But, it's weird you say that, and then there was, like, that number we saw the other day about, like, how texting had surpassed face-to-face interaction for younger people. Like 12 to 17 people, they talk more on text than they do face-to-face with other human beings. It blew my mind. But when you take into account that experience, it totally makes sense. Crazy.
We have time for just one more this evening, so go back this way.
Oh, brother. There's like 3 people that raise their hands. We'll answer these 3 guys. Oh, shit, there are now a bunch of other people raise their hands.
Hi. So you talked about deal breakers among women like this with men that were excessively texting them.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if you have any funny stories about deal breakers among men.
It was kind of the same thing, like there was a woman who said, or there was a guy who said, I remember there was a guy who said, all these things that, like, if a woman asked a guy out, it was the same kind of stuff applied in the reverse, But there was this one guy who talked about how he met this woman who was like, someone he really, really had a huge crush on. And he started dating her. He's like, oh my God, this is awesome. I'm so excited. And he was texting with her one time, and he said something like, hey, my friend Brian is having a party. Do you want to go? And he said, she wrote back and said, who? But she spelled who, H-O-O. And he was like, what? And then he kept trying to text her and integrate it so that she would have to say the word who in the text. And she kept spelling it H-O-O. And he's like, I can't go out with someone that doesn't know how to spell who. And they eventually broke up.
She was an owl.
We checked, she's not.
So my girlfriends and I would sit around and be like, oh, I got a message from, I just matched with him, blah, 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 blah. He's not contacting me. So you said that most of the time you still find that the men contact the women first. But what did you find, how did you feel like men felt when the woman contacted them first? Did they think it was hot that the woman took the initiative, or was it, oh my gosh, she's too desperate because she messaged me first?
I think there was a little bit of both. I mean, that thing about men and women is more that, like, the studies kind of showed, like, men are overwhelmingly the first ones to, like, ask the first date, not necessarily send the first message. I feel like we heard guys who were like, most of the guys I feel like would say, like, oh, it was really refreshing, and that pressure was taken off. And there was other guys who were like, oh, I don't know, it felt a little weird. But I mean, to me, I would say the douchier guys are the ones that said that. And kind of the nicer guys are like, oh man, it was really nice. Yeah.
Hi. So you talk about Tinder a lot in the book, and as someone who was
Talk about who? Sorry.
Tinder.
Tinder, sure.
Tinder. And as someone
you know
who was,
that already?
Yeah, how do you know what we talk about in the book?
I've been flipping through this, all the pictures
Okay,
and
all right.
screenshots. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
So I was on Tinder as well, and one of the things that helps me swipe left or right is what it says on the bio. So if you were on Tinder, what would your bio be?
If I was on
I'm putting you on
Tinder,
the spot. I know, but
I'm Aziz Ansari. Please don't murder me.
that was my bio too.
We'll do one more.
These two had a
Two more
question. We'll
questions.
do these guys and then wrap up.
All right. So obviously, like, there's a lot more options available for people to date, which has caused marriages to come later. But do you think that has contributed to the amount of stress and preparation that goes into marriage proposals? And when you see those videos online of the choreographed dancers and everything, and how everything has to be perfect and just right. I have a friend who made a Tumblr called "Sorry Not Ansari," trying to get you to come to the wedding.
Oh, okay.
Stuff like that. Do you think that always?
Well, I didn't go, I guess. A waste of a Tumblr account.
But do you think that has is that the reason why?
I mean, we didn't talk to people about marriage proposal, but when I did a stand-up tour where I talked about marriage, and in one chunk I would ask people about their marriage proposals, and when I went in, I was like, oh, people are always going to do something really extravagant and really blow it out for the marriage proposal, because I always thought if I ever proposed to someone, I would kind of do something pretty big. But I was really surprised. It was such a small percentage of people that actually did this big grandiose gesture. It was kind of more a subtle sweet thing. A lot of times it was oh, we just came back from dinner, or we went to dinner, we came back to the house, and it was more kind of a private, intimate thing, which I also get. It's that's kind of a special kind of private moment that wouldn't make sense to anyone but those two people. But the idea of oh, I had these horses, that was much more less common than I thought. My favorite one was this this guy said that he had, this was my favorite of the kind of elaborate proposals, was this guy said that he had, it was he said it was Christmas morning, and he had a puppy. She'd wanted a puppy, so he had a puppy that had a ring around its neck. And I was like, oh my God. So you're telling me it's Christmas morning. She comes downstairs, and this puppy just runs up with the ring around its collar. Oh my God. He's like, no. It wasn't a real puppy. It was a stuffed puppy. And I was like, no, let's go back to that reality where it was a real pup. I don't want to live in this world. All right.
With everything being so shareable now, did you guys kind of study the influence that people have when they kind of share their respective interactions online, and how their friends have an impact on the relationship? As opposed to introducing someone to their family, the first time they kind of show a potential mate is hey, I saw this douchebag on, OkCupid, what do you think? And then it has a real confluence of,
I mean, if you caption it that way, that's not going to be good.
Leading question.
I don't know. I don't think we didn't really delve into that. That wasn't really a thing that came up that much. I mean, that makes sense. I guess you kind of, if your parents are on Facebook or whatever and you're posting moments from your private life, it does kind of end up sharing your relationship with people before you normally would.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I don't think we realize the extent to which people are meeting online before we started this book. I mean, we saw one study we quote that shows that online dating is the main way people meet their spouses today. More people marry someone they met online than through any other form, and through many of the previously most common ones combined. But there's still a pretty big stigma in some communities around online dating, and so I don't think we heard as many stories about people introducing their new partner who they met on OkCupid to their friends on social media. we heard more like decoy stories. And maybe like thing we could do to end is like, in case anybody here needs a decoy story, like maybe you could give them a decoy story.
Oh, a decoy story? Do you have the one? I remember
how to meet somebody?
In the book. So the decoy stories, like people would say like, oh, I met the person here or there and on this site or that site, and I wouldn't want to tell my parents that or my friends that. So people would come up with decoy stories, which we think is very unnecessary given the prevalence of how people meet that way. But we have a couple. Do you have them here?
Yeah.
All right. So here are some decoy stories if you need them. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, and I decided to go to the movies. Everything was sold out except for a special Christmas screening of the Arnold Schwarzenegger film Jingle All the Way. I looked over and I saw one person in the theater. It was Janine. And I sat next to her and we started chatting. By the time Arnold had finally secured a Turbo Man doll for his son Jamie, we had already boned it out. Twice. This is another one. I was in the hallway of my apartment building, throwing out a bag of trash, when a small puppy walked up to me. We looked at each other, and then I turned around. He then tapped me with his paw. I turned around to face him. The puppy spoke in a voice that sounded old and raspy, with a strong southern accent, not unlike the one Kevin Spacey does in House of Cards. That said, Catherine, listen to me. You must go and find Daniel Reese. He will be your husband. I never saw the puppy again, and I never met a Daniel Reese. But that night I met Dave at a bar downtown. All right, thank you guys very much. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Strand. Thank you to Eric. Have a good evening. Good night.
Several years ago, my wife and I hired a manny, which is like a male nanny, who was the coolest person the two of us had ever met. And he came into our family at a really good time. We really needed childcare. But it was like that moment in a marriage. You've like been together for a long time. You spend a lot of nights together, and you could like need someone to bring you new stuff, like new cultural stuff, new ideas, like music that you're too old to find out on your own. And one night we were sitting around the table, and he's like, "Oh man, you've got to hear this comedian Aziz Ansari." We're like, "Who? Yeah, Aziz Ansari. He's the funniest guy." So he pulled out, a phone, and we started listening to Aziz Ansari stand up, and like totally fell in love with it. Thought this is the funniest guy I'd ever heard, and started watching all of his specials, and trying to track him down in Parks and Rec. And like, by the way, I'm like a trained professional sociologist. I spend most of my time doing social science, so I don't have a lot of companions in the sociology community who share my my fandom. And and a couple years ago. Several years ago, my wife and I hired a manny, which is like a male nanny, who was the coolest person the two of us had ever met. And he came into our family at a really good time. We really needed childcare. But it was like that moment in a marriage. You've like been together for a long time. You spend a lot of nights together, and you could like need someone to bring you new stuff, like new cultural stuff, new ideas, like music that you're too old to find out on your own. And one night we were sitting around the table, and he's like, "Oh man, you've got to hear this comedian Aziz Ansari." We're like, "Who? Yeah, Aziz Ansari. He's the funniest guy." So he pulled out, a phone, and we started listening to Aziz Ansari stand up, and like totally fell in love with it. Thought this is the funniest guy I'd ever heard, and started watching all of his specials, and trying to track him down in Parks and Rec. And like, by the way, I'm like a trained professional sociologist. I spend most of my time doing social science, so I don't have a lot of companions in the sociology community who share my my fandom. And a couple years ago, I was standing on the platform at Penn Station with 2 grocery bags in my hands, ready to go home upstate in the summer. I'm about an hour outside of the city, and it's hard to get good groceries. So I had these big bags full of groceries, and my phone rings, and it's my editor from the Penguin Press and the publisher of Penguin Press, Scott Moyers. And he says, Eric, I'm sorry for calling you out of the blue, but I wonder if you have a minute. And I always have a minute for Scott. And he said, look, have you ever heard of Aziz Ansari? And I said, Aziz Ansari is my